The only firm, irrevocable deadline that the Chinese Communist Party has given for so-called reunification of Taiwan is 2049. So there doesn't seem to be, that timetable doesn't imply any great rush, and yet you see quite a marked acceleration in the number of naval and aviation sorties around and against Taiwanese airspace, and a step up in the rhetoric. So this does imply some sort of haste or urgency in Xi Jinping's timetable.
And indeed, of course, they ignored the timetable that was set for Hong Kong very assertively. So does Taiwan have a lot to fear at the moment? And what could they reasonably expect when it comes to international support?
Well, fear is what the mainland Chinese government is trying to generate. This is a constant and escalating pressure campaign, and not only against Taiwan. We could also talk about the daily sorties now that the Chinese are flying into the contested airspace of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands with Japan. We could talk about the incursions increasingly into contested water and economic zones of Southeast Asian countries. So this is a uniform pattern, but it has particular potency for Taiwan because Taiwan is a so-called red line issue for Xi Jinping, for China. But there are two schools of thought about whether this is just an intimidation tactic, Bev, or whether it's the precursor to an invasion and a full-on armed takeover of the island of Taiwan.
Yeah.
On the one hand, the intimidation school says, no, the Chinese government's playing a long game. Time is on its side. It's building strength. It thinks the US is losing strength, and it's just going to keep going until events favour it for a painless reabsorption of Taiwan. On the other hand, the other school of thought says, no, this is Xi Jinping's lunge for greatness, and as you mentioned, he smashed all expectations and took direct control of Hong Kong. He's done a number of things which could be considered irrational because they've produced a backlash. For example, the most obvious is the creation of the Quad. The Quad countries have come together and formed a summit, as you know, with the US, Japan, India, Australia, in direct resistance to this new aggression and assertiveness by Xi Jinping. So this suggests that it's not necessarily going to be a rational move. Therefore, an earlier armed attack on Taiwan is possible, and the Biden administration has said that they have to expect one in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, which is interesting. And I wonder, when you consider the timing, given that Japan, the Quad, were priorities for the US when they started reasserting themselves in that foreign affairs space, do you think this is China retaliating to a degree to say, look, we're the boss in this region?
It's certainly, there's no sign yet that China has been in any way deterred by any of the things that have happened, including the creation of the Quad, including the increased coordination of naval manoeuvres by the Quad countries, including the increased resistance that they've been getting from countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, for example. There's no hint or sign that Xi Jinping is in any way hesitating. So where do you end up with that? You end up with an escalation on all sides.
It does point to how vulnerable global stability can be in the absence of US leadership. And how do you assess the impact of the Trump years in terms of the vacuum that it's created?
Well, the Trump 4 years had the effect of deeply unsettling, even scaring some US traditional allies. The NATO nations worried about Russia, and in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, US allies being abused and neglected and overlooked by Trump, worried about China, and that's chiefly Japan and South Korea. But perversely, it actually had a constructive effect. This uncertainty, this neglect and abuse that Trump wielded against US allies, because what it's done is in the European Union countries, the NATO countries, I should say, they are stepping up their defence spending. Countries in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, have stepped up the level of their preparedness and activity Australia, for example, it was only a couple of weeks ago that Scott Morrison announced the creation of an indigenous guided missile manufacturing capability that Australia's never had. The creation of the Quad is another good example. Japan is also stepping up the tempo of its military engagements and its related deals all around the region. Only a few weeks ago signed, for example, this is one of many examples, Japan signed a transfer of technology deal with Indonesia to allow them to give the Indonesians access to Japanese military technology. So perversely, Trump, by appearing to walk away from US allies, has energized US allies to do more in their own defense, and the Biden administration is a beneficiary of that.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to have an impact, though, when you look at these very determined players? We saw the US Intelligence Global Report saying some of these players are very determined in the competition for global influence. Even with that increased sort of consciousness of a military requirement, is it going to be enough?
Well, on the current indications, we have no. Both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are energized by the geopolitical contest. Xi Jinping in particular thinks that this is his great moment. Strive to achieve is the overriding strategic dictum of his time, as opposed to the one that prevailed for 30 years before it. You know, hide your brightness, bide your time. He said in a speech just a few weeks ago that China already looks at the world at its own level. In other words, we're no longer recognizing the US as greater or more powerful than us in any way. And he's feeding his entire political movement and his domestic political support base this narrative about the China dream, the restoration, rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. So by entering this contest, by being seen to be challenged by the US and others, this is helping Xi Jinping to tell his story and to feed the domestic support base through a sort of hyped up nationalism.
Good to talk as always, Peter. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Bev.